What's up, y'all? If you want captivating nonfiction stories from throughout American history, make sure to go check out the Making History Come Alive newsletter. They provide you with exciting articles and educators' resources that tie into your social studies curriculum. Free subscription for the first year. Link is in the description. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to American History Gazette. I'm Jake Suggs, and today we are joined by Neil Chatelain. Neil is an adjunct professor at Lone Star College. His studies focus on 19th century America, especially the Civil War. He has written 2 books on the Civil War, as well as several articles. He was mentioned as a Civil War Books and Authors Top 10 book of 2020 for his book, Defending the Arteries of Rebellion. Neil, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
When looking at your work, your article, Annual Freshet Impacts on the 1862's Mississippi River Campaign, caught my attention because the Mississippi River was such a crucial aspect of the Civil War, both to the Confederacy and to the Union. But before we get into the impact and all that stuff, can you explain to me what a freshet is and why that's important for the Mississippi River?
Yes, so a freshet is just an annual spring thawing of snowmelt. So the Mississippi River Valley encompasses a large water space all the way going as far as like Wyoming. And all that water from all these different rivers, the Ohio River, the Missouri River, and so on, they all feed into the Mississippi River. So when snow melts as far as Yellowstone National Park every year, it eventually makes its way to the Mississippi River. And then ultimately out into the Gulf of Mexico. And all of that water, when snow melts, the water levels of the river rise and then the currents on the river increase. And that has a major impact on transportation across the Mississippi River. It causes flooding. And then during the Civil War, it had a major impact on how both the United States and Confederacy impacted their campaign planning.
Yeah. The freshet of 1862 was particularly contentious, but we'll get into that later. I want to go into a little bit of context of the Civil War leading up to the Mississippi River Campaign. So the Mississippi River borders 10 states. Can you talk a little bit about which of those states were alleged to the Union and the Confederacy and kind of the animosity and context of that region?
Yes, so the Mississippi River does in fact border 10 states, and then the whole river valley borders a whole larger number that encompasses most of the continent. The 10 states that the Mississippi River borders are Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana. So 4 of those states, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, are firmly in the grasp of the United States. They remained loyal to the United States during the Civil War, and there's no question about that. 4 of those states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee, they secede. They all pass articles of secession and join the Confederacy, and they're allied with the Confederacy for the most part during the conflict. And then there are 2 other states, Kentucky and Missouri. Those are what we call the border states. At the beginning of the Civil War, Kentucky actually tried to declare itself neutral in the conflict, and ultimately it, for the most part, sided with the United States. Missouri also largely sided with the United States. However, both states contributed large numbers of soldiers to both armies, the United States and Confederate armies. So those states were very much up for grabs in a power play at the beginning of the war, and ultimately both sided with the United States overall.
Now, the Mississippi River was such an asset to each of the sides. How important was the Mississippi River to each of the respective sides? What did each side need control of the Mississippi River for?
So for the Confederacy, the Mississippi River is their great internal highway. And before the Civil War, it's the same for the United States. It provides access to port cities internally from the Gulf of Mexico, and it's a massive system of movement for the Confederacy. The problem is that the Mississippi River moves north to south, and unlike many of the rivers in Virginia, for example, that move east to west, and that's a major issue for the Confederacy, because if the United States can take advantage of this north to south movement, it provides a dagger right into the heart of the central part of the Confederate landmass as a whole. And so the United States is going to want to take control of this Mississippi River to create this dagger thrust into the Confederate heartland, where they don't need to have soldiers marching and they can transport everything by ship. It's a little bit easier. And the Confederates are definitely going to want to stop that. The United States of America, their major overall strategy for winning the war, what Winfield Scott, the general-in-chief of the U.S. Army at the start of the war, called the Anaconda Plan. That plan was threefold. Part one was to blockade Confederate ports to prevent access of Confederate supplies. Part two was to seize control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in two. And then part three is to defeat each split element in detail. If the United States can achieve that second element, to split the Confederacy in half, that prevents supplies from getting from one element of the Confederacy to the other. So, for example, all the cows that are being raised in Texas can't be used to feed soldiers in Tennessee, and all the guns being smuggled into South Carolina, for example, cannot be then smuggled across the Mississippi River to arm soldiers in Louisiana, for example. So it's a major force that the United States wants to maintain control of, because it will allow them to then open up shipping routes for their internal landmass areas, the Midwestern states, but it will also inhibit the Confederate war effort to a great deal.
You could say that the Confederacy needed the Mississippi River. Everything, all of their operations that they were doing revolved around the Mississippi River. Everything from, transports to men to food to arms. Jefferson Davis, the Confederacy president, the president of the Confederacy, said the Mississippi River is the great artery of the Confederacy. Everything went through the Mississippi River. And the Union, obviously, you were talking about the Anaconda Plan. I definitely wanted to get into that. They wanted to, like you said, that three-stage plan. But if they were able to gain control of the Mississippi River, it would choke the life out of the Confederacy, like an anaconda. I believe that's why it was called the Anaconda Plan, because if they gained control of the Mississippi River, it would choke the life out of the Confederacy, because they would have zero ability to transport goods and men and food. So up until the Mississippi River Campaign, which started in 1861, what was the context of the war? I know the war started, it's still early on, but what was the context of the war? Was it still even, or was there a clear side who had the upper hand?
So the first year of the war is very chaotic. 1861 is a year where people are still trying to figure out what exactly is going on. Everyone expected a short conflict, but after the first battles in Virginia, the first Battle of Bull Run, both armies begin this system of training. The farther west you go, it's even more chaotic, because everybody's making a power play for control of Tennessee and Missouri. The Confederate Army moves into Kentucky, and eventually that sways Kentucky more towards the United States. Confederate forces are in Missouri, and they get expelled out of Missouri towards the end of 1861 for the most part. And in general, that's how those two states end up largely siding with the United States overall. But there's, at the same time, a very large buildup in 1861 of naval forces in the Mississippi River Valley. Both the United States and the Confederacy are making pushes to acquire, construct, build, convert any sort of ship that's available on the Mississippi River and its tributary and distributary systems. So the United States makes a push to build these ironclad warships called the Eads gunboats. The Pook turtles is what they're called sometimes, just because they're very slow and they're very wide, sort of resemble a turtle. And the United States builds these kind of in record time, in just a few months. The Confederacy is also trying to build ironclad warships predominantly at the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, and then secondarily at Memphis, Tennessee. And both sides are pushing to build these ironclad warships to fight one another. So then they're basically saying, if we can build these warships first, get them deployed first, and they can overpower the enemy ships before the other side has the chance to deploy their ships, they can gain superiority over the river. And then both sides are also acquiring a host of wooden war steamers as well. A lot of them are just tugs with cannons mounted on the decks. Others are merchant ships that are trapped in one area or another when the war starts, and they get bought by their respective governments and armed as well. But so it's a large collection of transports, civilian ships, ironclad warships, improvised warships, all sort of conglomerated together into these respective fleets that are going to end up facing one another.
Yeah, at the outbreak, both sides naval warfare was a new thing in US military history. Obviously there was some in the Revolution, but especially in terms of the Mississippi River, naval warfare was a completely new thing. So at the outbreak, they really realized the importance of control of the Mississippi. So like you said, all resources went into start making ships. They anything that they could convert into a ship that was suitable for war, they were going to do it.
Yeah, the at the beginning of the war, the United States sent one of their engineering officers to inspect every single dock and port on the Ohio River and the Upper Mississippi, and they basically made this giant report of here are the numbers of ships that are capable. These are the numbers of ships that we can use. These are the places they could land and operate out of, and so it kind of became this main focal point for a lot of efforts early on.
But the Union, in terms of manufacturing and producing ships, they had the upper hand because all of the industry and factories in America all resided in the North. The South obviously relied on cotton and plantations. So the Union was able to pump out a lot more ships and industrial war material, which kind of played into each side's strategy when it came to gaining or maintaining control of the Mississippi River, which I want to get into next. The Confederacy kind of took on a more defensive strategy with blockades and stuff like that, and the Union took on a more aggressive strategy because they had the upper hand in naval power.
Yeah, so you're right. The United States had far more of an industrial capacity. The Confederacy did have some factories in the New Orleans area, predominantly in the river valley, some industrial capacity at Memphis, Tennessee, a little bit at Nashville, Tennessee. But you're right in that St. Louis, Missouri, and Cincinnati, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania had a far wider industrial capacity, and that allowed the United States to build their ironclad warships in 4 months, whereas the Confederates spent 8 months trying to do it, and they still weren't ready to go at that point. So it allowed them to build things much faster in a much more efficient manner. Now, as far as the strategies go, the United States has a twofold element to gain control of the Mississippi River. They want to attack the river from both ends, coming up from its mouth up, and then coming down from below, downriver from Missouri and Ohio and Illinois and such. The first part is they establish a blockade of the mouth of the Mississippi River to blockade New Orleans. The Confederates do, in fact, try to break that blockade late in 1861. They kind of dent it, but it doesn't work so well, and the blockade remains in place. And then that blockading force is going to ultimately be the force that does advance upriver and capture New Orleans in 1862. Whereas then the United States is also building those ironclads and gunboats upriver, and they're going to cooperate with United States Army forces, General John Pope, General Ulysses Grant, and so on, to move downriver and eventually take out Confederate positions. The Confederates are very much building static fortifications to protect the Mississippi River. The antebellum idea for the United States after the War of 1812 relied heavily on coastal fortifications to protect port cities, and the Confederates essentially adopted that same mindset of we're going to build large forts at major turning points and bends in the river so that ships coming around those river bends have to slow down under the guns of these forts. And then the Confederate warships are going to augment those forts so that if anyone gets past them, then the warships will meet ship to ship and engage one another. So the Confederates are very much on a static position where mobile armies will reinforce those forts and their ships will help defend them, whereas the United States is going to try to besiege and capture these positions, these strong points on the river. Because if those strong points are captured, then they can free flow supplies, men, material up and down the river at will at that point.
The Union kind of carried downriver in this fort to fort campaign, just taking each fort downriver quite successfully. But the spring of 1862 saw a very severe freshet, and I would like to get into that. How bad was the freshet of 1862, and how did that impact the campaigns of the Union and the Confederacy?
Yeah, so the spring thaws of 1862, the freshet was extremely high. It caused the river to flood in basically every location, and it's not just the Mississippi River flooding. The Ohio River is flooding. The Tennessee and Cumberland rivers are flooding. The Red River, the Arkansas River, they're all at flood stage as the campaigns begin to commence. And that depends on which day exactly they reach their highest point, depending on when exactly the weather melts, snows in each area. But overall, from around February to around May, June, sometimes even in July, the water levels are extremely high in a large element of the Mississippi River Valley, and that's going to have a direct impact on how those military campaigns and naval campaigns go. You're right in that the United States in 1862 makes a large push down the Mississippi River from their main staging base at Cairo, Illinois, and it's got two major thrusts. One is down into the heart of Tennessee through the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. That's Ulysses Grant capturing Forts Henry and Donelson, which are protecting the heartland of Tennessee and breaching the Confederate defenses in Kentucky and Tennessee. And then there are other fortifications along the Mississippi River. There's Columbus, Kentucky. The Confederates evacuate that position after Forts Henry and Donelson surrender because kind of outflanked. They retreat to this place called Island Number 10, which is downriver from Columbus, Kentucky. And there's an entire month-long siege there. After that position is captured by the United States, the Confederates retreat to the next fort, which is Fort Pillow in Tennessee, which is guarding Memphis. And Ulysses Grant's army fighting the Battle of Shiloh and then attacking under Henry Halleck's unified command to seize Corinth, Mississippi in mid-1862. That outflanks Memphis and causes those fortifications to fall. Meanwhile, everybody's advancing up the river from New Orleans, and everybody meets in the middle. The two U.S. fleets coming from up and down river meet in the middle at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, the freshet is having a major impact on all of these campaigns. When U.S. gunboats and ironclads move to attack Fort Henry in February 1862, the fort is half flooded because it's sited on low ground, and the overpressure from the water is flooding half of the cannons in the fort. And so the battle is not really much of one because the Fort Henry evacuates, and just a rear guard faces the U.S. ironclads so that the rest of the garrison can retreat. So flooding immediately made an impact there. At Island Number 10, the flooding caused fields to flood in all the different areas, forcing the United States to have very limited access to where they could approach the Confederate fortifications by land. But it also flooded some backcountry roads that the United States then used to funnel in barges so that they could sneak around some Confederate fortifications. So both sides are trying to use this flooded terrain to their advantage. At Fort Pillow, Tennessee, the river floods, and when some ships maneuver, some of them get trapped in some swamps that are overflowing, and it causes some limited maneuverability there. At New Orleans, when the U.S. warships get past the Confederate fortifications there, when they approach the city of New Orleans, the ships are higher than the city because the river is so high, it's just about to crest the levee, and the guns are literally aimed down into the city instead of across at the city. And so the city kind of surrenders because they don't have much of a choice at that point. And even at Vicksburg, when the Confederates tried to finish one of their ironclads on the Yazoo River just north of Vicksburg, the entire Yazoo River basin was flooded, and the ship was essentially abandoned for a while in the middle of what became a lake instead of a dock because nobody could get to it. And so there's a significant impact on how the river became a third actor. There's the U.S. forces, the Confederate forces. The river is its own actor in these 1862 campaigns that commanders on both sides have to deal with. And you're right, you mentioned earlier that neither side had much riverine combat experience, and that's very true The Revolution had very limited river action. The War of 1812 had no major river battles, some on the Great Lakes, but not river actions. The Mexican-American War, nothing with rivers. It's not until the Civil War that people begin having these major riverine activity in North America, and the commanders just are not used to it. In fact, the naval forces upriver that are coming down, they're in charge of naval officers who then answer to army generals. They don't actually have a full chain of command, and there's arguments about who's going to pay the bills, the army or the navy, because of what jurisdiction they're in. So there's infighting on both sides about that kind of stuff, the organization behind everything as well. So it's very confusing for both sides in these conflicts as the river impacts their thoughts and planning and operations.
Yeah, I think you brought up a great point there that the Mississippi River became an actor of its own in this conflict because no one was the annual freshet it's a known thing, but no one was prepared for this scale of flooding, and the learning curve was massive for each of the commanders of their respective sides because no one had ever seen this before. And you were saying that there was a lot of miscommunication because no one knew how to handle this. You know what I mean? So the learning curve was absolutely massive, but I want to backtrack a little bit. In reading your article, you talked a lot about the currents, the difficulty of navigating the river because of the strong currents and the floods. So how did this freshet and the high water levels affect the supply chains of the Union and Confederacy during the Mississippi River campaign?
All right, so I'll talk about currents and then I'll talk about the supply chain stuff. So a river obviously flows one direction, and as ships move down the river, if they're moving downriver with the current, then obviously they move faster. And if you're going upriver against a current, then the current's acting against you and you go slower. But there's also a second factor to consider, and that's maneuverability. These ships are using rudders, or they're using these side wheel propellers that are moving the ships along. And if a ship is going downriver and the current is pushing behind them, well, then they have less water moving across their rudder, and they're actually a less maneuverable but faster ship. If you're moving upriver against the current, the water is pushing against your rudder more, so you're moving slower, but you're more maneuverable and you can control your ship more. And so there's a speed versus maneuverability factor that people have to take into consideration, both in combat operations, but also in non-combat situations of just standard maneuvering and transportation of ships and supplies. Now, the supply chain situation becomes very precarious for both sides because it's not just the river flooding battle sites, it's also threatening urban centers and transportation centers and logistics centers. New Orleans, the river almost overtopped the levees and flooded the city, and it threatened to flood some of the railroad networks connecting the city of New Orleans for the Confederacy. And so they were worried about being able to transport supplies and material through their limited railroad infrastructure. For the United States, St. Louis, Missouri almost flooded. East St. Louis in Illinois, just across the river, did flood. And in fact, there was a riot in East St. Louis, Missouri, where soldiers had to be called out to protect the supplies because the supplies were being protected over people's houses. In Cairo, Illinois, the main staging base for the United States military effort and thrust downriver, that town almost flooded completely as well. The levees almost overtopped. And in fact, in a couple of places, railroad infrastructure was destroyed and other railroad elements were saved only because they diverted some water to flood, civilian homes and such. So there is a precarious situation going on where the question of, do we save infrastructure? Do we save housing? Do we save warehouses full of supplies? Or do we save the docks that are going to be able to bring more ships in with more supplies? And the limited infrastructure when flooding starts happening means you can only pick some things and not all of them to save in some matters. And that had a serious impact on the ability of both sides to maintain their supply flow. And so there are limited supplies that happen. There are shortages of supplies that happen as some of these armies march in Tennessee during the 1862 campaign. But there's also significant limited supplies for the ships. The Confederate naval forces on the river in 1862, at one point, they only had about 50 rounds of ammunition for their cannons for each ship. And their commanding officer, the captain of the squadron, essentially said, don't shoot at U.S. ships unless they get really close and we know we can hit them. We're not going to waste ammunition. And then coal was always a precarious and limited resource as well. And so sometimes the ships were immobilized, not because of weather or because they were disabled, but because they didn't have the coal to transport them, to keep their engines moving so they could move.
I think you brought up a great aspect of this conversation that we haven't talked about yet, and that was the impact on civilian life. You talked about how the government was facing a dilemma. Do we save the railroads for transportation? Do we save the docks so we can bring more ships in, or do we save homes? The civilian impact of the freshet was massive. I mean, people's homes were getting flooded. They had to relocate. Can you go a little bit more into the civilian impact of the freshet?
Yeah, so depending on the location, it impacted people differently, of course, but there are documented accounts of civilians trying to escape the movement of the river itself. A lot of the battle sites where the river were being fought over were not urban centers, like Island Number 10. There's a small town, New Madrid, Missouri, right there, but there's not a huge city. Memphis is there as well, and New Orleans is there, and that the water levels are affecting those cities, threatening flooding, especially in New Orleans. In fact, in the city of New Orleans, people were told essentially, like, be prepared to evacuate the town if necessary because it might flood. And New Orleans in 1861 has 180,000 people in it, and so you can't just evacuate 180,000 people in land that's surrounded by swamp already while fighting a military campaign. And so it's essentially the Confederate government said, well, you civilians are on your own if this place floods, while we try to evacuate supplies and deal with the U.S. Navy trying to approach the city. And then the same situations that happen farther north upriver, where the United States, where civilians in East St. Louis, Illinois, they're forced to evacuate their town. They have to relocate to St. Louis, Missouri. And, they have to rebuild their lives after the fact, after the flooding subsides. And so there are major civilian impacts on both sides of the conflict as this river floods. So it's not just, the military and naval aspects, but it's also civilian logistical aspects as well.
Wow, that's quite unfortunate. We see New Orleans face problems of flooding time and time again. Obviously, the 2005 Hurricane Katrina was just devastating. The whole city was flooded. Its geography is quite tumultuous. But back to the Mississippi River campaign. The Union has been taking fort after fort, down the river, upriver, and it all comes to a point at the Battle of Vicksburg. Jefferson Davis called Vicksburg the nailhead that holds the South's two halves together, and President Lincoln said, Vicksburg is the key. So why was Vicksburg so important? Why was it the last stand, and what was the outcome? I believe there was several unsuccessful attempts at first.
Yeah, so Vicksburg is the key, mainly because the United States meets their two fleets meet in the middle, and that's the only place left where the Confederates have a major grasp. And so it becomes the focal point of Confederate resistance from about July 1862 through for an entire year to July 1863 when it ultimately surrenders. Multiple efforts are made to capture the city of Vicksburg. The U.S. Navy attempts to capture it on its own, and that fails because they don't have the supporting military forces to capture it. The Confederates launch a major counterattack in 1862 when one of their ironclads on the Yazoo River does get completed, and it essentially stalls the U.S. Navy long enough from capturing Vicksburg until the freshet ends and the Mississippi River levels begin dropping, and the U.S. Navy forces that came upriver from New Orleans, well, if they have to evacuate from the Vicksburg area or their ships are all going to run aground as the river levels drop. And so the river essentially forces the campaign in 1862 to end on its own in that position. just from the fact that the freshet starts and then it ends. At the end of 1862, Ulysses Grant tries to capture the city of Vicksburg through a couple of different avenues by land routes. Those fail due to Confederate cavalry raids. And then in 1863, they try to use the river again. Ulysses Grant tries to divert the Mississippi River to bypass the city of Vicksburg. In fact, several years after the Civil War, the place where he tried to divert the river, another river flood is going to complete that diversion. In the city of Vicksburg today, the Mississippi River does not pass at the same place that it did during the war. And so river channels do shift over time, and the U.S. tried to physically man-make one of those new river channels during the war. In other places, they'll flood levees to try to get it into some bayous to get to the back areas of Vicksburg. Those are ultimately stopped and halted. And eventually the U.S. Navy rushes past Vicksburg with gunboats, ironclads, and transports. And then they ferry the U.S. Army under Ulysses Grant across the Mississippi River in 1863. Grant then does a land campaign to surround the city of Vicksburg while the U.S. Navy is bombarding it from the river. And then simultaneously, a similar effort is being done downriver in Louisiana at Port Hudson, Louisiana. And both of those fortifications surrender in July 1863, one after the other. And that's what clears the Mississippi River for the United States, as those two final fortifications closing. But it took an entire year of effort just to gain those two, even after all the successes of the United States in the 1862 river campaigns.
Yeah, the Union faced a lot of adversity to capture Vicksburg, and they eventually got the key they were looking for. After the Battle of Vicksburg, they won, and they now had full control of the Mississippi River. I find it kind of ironic that Confederates surrendered Vicksburg on July 4th, Independence Day, and you could argue that the Battle of Vicksburg and control of the Mississippi won the Union the war. So in my head, I'm thinking the Confederates surrendered on Independence Day, and in a way, they gave up. They lost their independence as the Confederate States of America on Independence Day, just a day after the victory at the Battle of Gettysburg, which occurred on July 3rd. So the Union really hit them with a 1-2 combo and basically destroyed any hope of the Confederacy winning the war. These two victories basically sealed the deal, and the war was essentially over. So after the victory at Vicksburg and Gettysburg, how did the rest of the war play out? Was there any attempts to regain control of the Mississippi River from the Confederates, or was all hope lost?
Yeah, so the Confederates were very resourceful, and even after all of their major fleet was destroyed in 1862, they made major efforts to reconstitute a fleet using different locations further in the interior of their country through these tributary river systems. The Confederates try to build a fleet of ironclads at Yazoo City, Mississippi, that when the U.S. Navy is bombarding Vicksburg, they have to send an entire squadron of ships up the Yazoo River to make sure that those Confederate ironclads never get finished. And so it's a major logistical standpoint there. The Confederates try to reconstitute an ironclad force in the lower bayous of Louisiana, and the U.S. has to send ships there to clear that area out before those are ready. The Confederates do reconstitute and build an ironclad at Shreveport, Louisiana, up the Red River, and then they have several wooden warships and steamers that are augmenting it. So it's definitely not a situation of Vicksburg surrenders and Port Hudson surrenders, and the war in the Mississippi River is lost completely. The United States still has all of these tributary systems they have to clear out as well. They're all well protected and defended, and it's going to take 2 more years for them to even get there. In fact, when the war ends in 1865, the United States still has not gained control of the Red River in Louisiana. It's still in Confederate hands. Their defenses there proved strong enough to stave off assaults in 1864. And so it's definitely not a situation of Vicksburg surrenders and the River War is over. the major river battles are over because the Confederate fleet is much smaller and is playing a purely defensive role at that point and has surrendered the initiative to the United States completely. But the U.S. Navy is now escorting convoys of supply ships down the river from like St. Louis, Missouri to New Orleans to make sure that Confederate partisans and guerrilla forces do not hinder them. They're also clearing out these tributary systems. They clear the Yazoo River like 3 or 4 different times because Confederate forces just keep coming back. So it's definitely a situation of the Confederates know that they've been beaten on the main river, but now they're going to defend the interior of that river valley, and they do it quite effectively in a number of places. In some places, not so well, but in a few places, they do it really effectively, and it keeps a lot of those waterways in Confederate hands for a substantial amount of time, even to the end of the war in the case of the Red River.
Interesting. So after the Union gained control of the main river, it was basically just a slow burn for the next 2 years until the war was finally over. Kind of an annoyance to the Union that they just had to clear all these small tributaries and things of that nature. There's one more point that I want to touch on, and you alluded to it earlier with Vicksburg. The freshet of 1862 and the subsequent floodings of the Mississippi River and hurricanes and things of that nature have drastically changed the geography of the Mississippi River Valley over the years in the past 170, 180 years. So there's a lot of battlefields and battlegrounds that took place during the river campaign that were unable to be preserved. So why is it that so many of the Mississippi River battlegrounds are no longer accessible to the public?
Yeah, so the nature of water is that it can shift its location. And as a result, thanks to rising waters, falling waters, shifting waters, and currents, you're correct in that a significant portion of the main battle sites where these naval battles were fought, where these river battles were fought, they just don't exist anymore. And that's either because the rivers have changed course, or they've flooded areas completely, or hurricanes have damaged or destroyed those areas. And so there's a host of examples that we can look at. Fort Henry, Tennessee, you cannot visit it today. It is underwater because that river has completely inundated the area. And so, and that's all because of the New Deal programs to expand water access and things like that. And so they actually flooded the battleground where that fortification was. And you cannot go visit it today. You can go visit Fort Donelson today, which is very well preserved, but Fort Henry is completely inaccessible and underwater. Island number 10 does not exist anymore. The island was formed during an earthquake earlier in the 1800s, and thanks to shifting waters, the entire island has dissipated, and the river channel has shifted to the point where it no longer exists. And so that's completely gone as well. And so you can go visit New Madrid, Missouri, where the Confederates had a couple of forts, but that town is very small and there's almost no markers or anything there because very few people live there and very fewer even go visit there for the Civil War history of it. Vicksburg, Mississippi, the river has completely changed its course, and so you cannot see it the same way you would see it as during the war. Now, the fortifications are very well preserved at Vicksburg because they're high up on bluffs above the river level, but an element of it is that you cannot see the river the same way that it was at the time, and so it kind of takes away from some of the view for visitors when they go to see the Vicksburg areas because you can't understand the full grasp and importance of that river bend because it's not there anymore. And so there's a little bit of imagination that has to happen when you try to understand the importance of it visually. And the same thing is with Port Hudson, Louisiana. The Mississippi River has shifted course there as well. And so it's the exact same situation of the fortifications are well preserved, but the river itself is in a different location overall. Other places, the it's not the river that caused changes, but urban sprawl. So St. Louis, Missouri is much larger today than what it was in the Civil War era. Memphis, Tennessee is much larger today. New Orleans, Louisiana is much larger today. And so these places, the urban sprawl, like in New Orleans, there you cannot go visit where the shipyards were that helped to build some of the Confederate ironclads. It's a park now. And so those shipyards are not shipyards today. And so it's hard to grasp the geography of where everything is just because of the nature of how cities grow. And then even further downriver, the forts protecting New Orleans, those forts are now closed to the public because they're too dangerous to let people into them. Most recently, after Hurricane Katrina, it flooded those forts, and then FEMA used those fortifications, what was left of them, as a staging base for recovery and movement of supplies. And so you can drive to the fortifications that are below New Orleans right now, Forts Jackson and St. Philip. Fort St. Philip is only accessible by boat. Fort Jackson has a road that goes to it, but you can't go into the fort. You can just drive around its perimeter. And that's because the fort flooded during Hurricane Katrina. Much of its artifacts were destroyed, and it's just not stable anymore. And that's the same thing for a lot of the coastal fortifications of southern Louisiana, other forts around the New Orleans area that also were protecting the city, but were not attacked during the Civil War. But like they're lost at this point, or essentially lost, just because of coastal erosion, hurricane flooding, and so on. So it's kind of difficult because people who study the Civil War love to say you got to go to the battlefield to see what it looks like personally so you can understand the geography of how these movements go. And for the River War, it's really difficult to do that because the river is not where it once was and the geography has changed. And it's the same for a lot of the coastal fortifications too. Fort Fisher in North Carolina is half eroded. Morris Island, where the 54th Massachusetts charged Fort Wagner, which was famous in the movie Glory, that chunk of that island is underwater, is in the Atlantic Ocean now. So like these coastal areas and these river areas, it's hard to get the true grasp of that geography because the geography is not what it once was. And that significantly impacts how historians can understand what happened, but also how people can view and enjoy those sites today. It's much easier to go to Gettysburg or Chancellorsville or see the land positions in Vicksburg or to go to the Battle of Shiloh. It's much more difficult to understand these naval river battles.
Yeah, it's incredible the power of Mother Nature to just drastically shift the geography in such a short period of time. And also, you talked a little bit about man made inventions that also shifted for the growing urban environment. But you're right, it is a shame that there's a lot of these important battlefields that we're no longer able to visit and we're not able to go out and pay our respects and as a historian appreciate what took place there because they're no longer there. But that wraps us up. I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was a great conversation. I learned a ton reading your work on the Mississippi River Campaign. It's an aspect of the Civil War that I wasn't too familiar with going into it, because obviously all the focus goes on Fredericksburg and Gettysburg and Robert E. Lee and things of that nature. But why don't you tell us what you have coming up? What are you working on? Any books coming out anytime soon?
Yeah, so I have a book under contract with McFarland and Company right now. Its working title is called Treasure and Empire: The Panama Route, the West, and the Campaigns to Control America's Mineral Wealth. And it's a focus on how the United States and Confederacy attempted to try to use essentially the gold from California, from the gold rush, to finance their war efforts. The United States is transporting that gold by ship from California to Panama Isthmus to New York City to finance and stabilize their economy. The Confederacy is trying to intercept those shipments of gold by sea to beef up their own treasury, but also they're trying to send soldiers into the American Southwest to try to intercept those gold mines and those mineral mines directly. And so it's more of a big hybrid between naval history, the history of the far west in the war, and economic and diplomatic history all tied into one to make a pretty interesting story, I hope.
That sounds like a fascinating story. Hopefully, one day we'll see you again on American History Gazette for your book release. We can talk about it. But, Neil, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to link your work, your articles, and your books on Amazon in the description below. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. It was great to be here.